Well, welcome everyone to Thales College and to the inaugural lecture in the, and I gotta see if I can get this right, the Sidney and Cecil Smith Lectures on Virtue. Hopefully the first of many. This will be beginnings of a long tradition. Tonight's lecture was originally intended to be the second lecture in the series, but unfortunately our speaker in January, Professor Ken Calvert, also from Hillsdale, had to cancel his trip due to illness. So, like Henry VIII, about whom I expect we'll be hearing a good deal in a few moments, this evening's lecture is a second son, thrust by unexpected circumstances into assuming the mantle and distinction of the firstborn. I have no doubt it will rise to the occasion. No pressure. I want to say a special welcome and thank you to Mr. Robert Luddy, the founder of Thales College, and to Miss Christine Smith, whose generous donation in honor of her parents has made this lecture series possible. Miss Smith could not be with us here tonight, but though we hope that she'll watch the video afterwards. And finally, to our lecture, welcome this evening Professor Stephen Smith, Dean of Humanities, Temple Family Chair in English Literature, and Professor of English at Hillsdale College. At Hillsdale, Professor Smith's teaching focuses on Thomas More, Shakespeare, Milton, and Dante's Divine Comedy. His online classes on Shakespeare and Dante have been enjoyed by students old and new around the US and the globe. He hopes in all his teaching to share a little spark of real fire and fresh desire for learning and new life with others. He aims to help his students begin a lifelong friendship with the great authors. That's also our aim here at Thales College, who have so much wit and solid wisdom to offer us on living well and happily, especially in stormy or tyrannous times. Steve and his wife, the incomparable Laura, live in Hillsdale with their 4 children, Will, Nicholas, Thomas, and Grace, and a new dog, apparently. I don't know how new is Rosie?
6 months.
6 months, okay. Who apparently likes to chew on his favorite books. That's your favorite. The Smith Lectures on Virtue will aim to explore different themes and facets of virtue, always with an eye towards application, applying what we've learned to our lives and to our own somewhat stormy times in the 21st century. The theme of the first 2 lectures, tonight's and the one that was canceled, though we hope to reschedule it in the future, is virtuous leadership. And so I thought it was appropriate if I introduce tonight's lecture by reading a very short passage from a little book called Virtuous Leadership by Alexander Havard that we read with all our first-year students at Thales College. Havard writes, "Leadership is not reserved to an elite. It is the vocation not of the few, but of the many. Heads of state and school teachers, captains of industry and housewives, military chiefs of staff and healthcare workers all exercise leadership. People expect them to do the right thing, to be men and women of character and virtue, to be motivated by a magnanimous vision of all those in their charge." That's the kind of virtuous leadership we will be learning about this evening. None of us is ever likely to become Lord High Chancellor of England. I think that was the term, right? But we all need those kinds of leaders in our lives, and we need to become those kinds of leaders in the world. Professor Smith's talk is titled, "Thomas More, the Life and Death of a Leading Citizen." Professor Smith.
Well, it is wonderful to be here at Thales, and my thanks to Mr. Robert Luddy and to all the great folks at Thales for the warm welcome and the assistance on putting this talk together, and especially to our donor for the Smith Lectures. And sorry you can't be here. I hope you enjoy the talk. Very briefly, before I get into the talk itself, 2 things. One, I want to say a word about Thomas More, and then also a word of thanks to a dear friend. So first, whenever we get together and whenever anyone teaches and has that experience, I think we all know we stand on the shoulders of giants. And for me, after many, many years of studying Thomas More, here I am in North Carolina before you. And I just want to begin with a word of appreciation for my teacher and mentor, Gerard Wegemer, who taught me everything I know about Thomas More. He is a professor down at the University of Dallas, the co-director of the Center for Thomas More Studies. And he is the best thinker in the world on the subject of tonight's talk, which is Thomas More's understanding of leading citizenship. So thanks to him, and a great affection for my teacher and friend. Now, on Thomas More himself, just to be crystal clear, you may have heard of the author of Care for the Soul, Thomas More. This is not that Thomas More. This is the Renaissance statesman and author. He rose to the Lord Chancellorship of England, the highest office in the land outside of the king. And he was also the author of Utopia. To make a long story short, he resigned his office, and then he refused to take the oath offered to him, which implied first that Henry was the head of the church in England and a few other things. He was imprisoned and then put on trial for treason and executed on July the 6th, 1535. If you've seen the film, A Man for All Seasons, this is the Thomas More I'll be talking about tonight. And if you'd like a biography on Thomas More, you should make a beeline to my mentor's book, Thomas More, Portrait of Courage, Gerard Wegemer, and of course to the film Man for All Seasons, which is one of the great fictional depictions of a virtuous leader that I've studied. So a couple of opening comments. So let's begin with an introduction. Admired as a man for all seasons during his lifetime and called a complete man afterwards, Thomas More, and for those of you who like dates, 1478 to 1535, has intrigued generations of citizens and leaders, writers and thinkers alike. William Shakespeare, for example, wrote of Thomas More as living justice for truth's sake and his conscience in the late play King Henry VIII. That's very grand. Shakespeare also collaborated on the mysterious and, it's quite all right. I thought it was very grand, you know. A lot of people don't appreciate Shakespeare's King Henry VIII as much as I do, and whoever arranged for the trumpet blast there does. But Shakespeare also collaborated on the mysterious and unproduced play Sir Thomas More, a lot of people don't know, during the reign of King Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth. In that work, Thomas More is remembered as a great London citizen, a man who embodies the marriage of wit and wisdom and serves as the vigilant protector of his country through his loyal industry and his diligent work. He's also called the best friend the poor ever had in London. Later in the 18th century, the Anglican clergyman and genius Jonathan Swift numbered Thomas More among the 6 greatest defenders of liberty in Gulliver's Travels. And he went so far to claim in another place that Thomas More was, quote, the person of the greatest virtue these islands ever produced. For an author with a reputation, unfair I might add, for pessimism, this is high praise indeed. And it surprises many to learn that Thomas More was added to the Anglican calendar in the 1980s. Closer to our own time, the statesman Sir Winston Churchill admired the courage and heroic stand of Thomas More and John Fisher against King Henry's growing tyranny, especially when King Henry had himself declared the head of the church in England. Finally, the great wit G.K. Chesterton argued that Thomas More, quote, may come to be counted the greatest Englishman, or at least the greatest historical character in English history. In the 1920s, Chesterton also discerned that Thomas More represented, quote, a type, a turning point, and an ultimate destiny. And he claimed Thomas More would become truly important in about 100 years' time, a time we are approaching rapidly in our own lives. He wrote that, I believe it was 1929. So we are in a T-minus 5-year countdown to the fulfillment of G.K. Chesterton's prophecy. He said, right about now, we would need the example of somebody like Thomas More. About 100 years ago. Very interesting. Why would a writer like Chesterton make such a striking prophecy about More's importance for our times? How could one free and educated citizen, one professional, one father, one friend, make an impact like More did, first on his own country and then across the centuries, such that he would be canonized in 1935, named Lawyer of the Millennium by the Law Society of Great Britain in 1999, and finally proclaimed Patron of Statesmen and Governors by John Paul II at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. For tonight's talk, let's look at what More's life, writings, and example may offer for our benefit at the present time. In particular, what may we learn about the true needs of a human being, a country, and a culture from Thomas More's story? What does a country and culture truly need to achieve excellence, to rise to a life of stable, consistent, authentic greatness and lasting peace, especially at a time when civil war again threatens us? In brief, and this is the first major point of the talk, I think we need another Renaissance, a real rebirth, as surely as Thomas More's England did. One of the cries of that earlier Renaissance was ad fontes, the urging that we return to the fonts, to the great and classic sources of wisdom in our tradition on living well, both personally and politically. Those sources are still there, perhaps forgotten and neglected by many, yet waiting for us nevertheless. Those sources still have the potency to instruct and help us if we can find them again, if we have the humility to study them again, if we desire wisdom again, if we can wonder again about the best way for human beings to live. When Thomas More himself returned to these classic sources, he recovered an important ideal, that of leading citizenship, an ideal he discovered in the Roman philosopher Cicero and other ancients, and then developed in his own distinctive way. Any lasting renaissance in a country, More suggests, requires a renaissance of leading citizenship, a rebirth of real, live leading citizens. So how exactly did Thomas More understand leading citizenship? What is a leading citizen in More's mind? Called an English Christian Cicero by one biographer, Thomas More was indebted to Cicero's understanding of the statesman, or what may be more usefully rendered, the first or leading citizen, a translation of a key Latin term, as one scholar has pointed out. In his book on the Republic, Cicero laments the lack of leading citizens at the present time. The absence of such leading figures is, quote, a great tragedy for Rome, such that, quote, we are left with the name of a republic, having long since lost the substance of one, end quote. Famous line from Cicero. As one great Thomas More scholar explains, in any given state, that ruling part, well, for Cicero, is the group of the most eminent leading citizens who are responsible for steering the ship of state. This is all a quote. These leading citizens emerge as first by the proven quality of their service in bringing about the good of the republic as a whole. Such leaders arise because they are first in wisdom and eloquence in the Senate, in the assembly of the people, and in public causes requiring spirit and courage. They rise readily to first place if they have the natural talent and have worked hard to achieve the mastery of those skills in governing that are required. Maintaining that position of trust, this scholar goes on, requires proving their loyalty, their steadfastness, their greatness of soul through many political storms and through the whole of their lives. Here, I think, is a challenging, great, and noble ideal of leadership, and one that attracted the young Thomas More and the best of his mind, his heart, and his spirit. Like Cicero, his teacher, Thomas More saw the great need for leading citizens in his own time, for the sake of his family, his friends, and his country's future. Without the indispensable work of leading citizens, More saw that a country risks descending into civil war, into meanness, mediocrity, madness, even outright tyranny. As the leaders go, so goes the republic, as Plato suggested. As the leading citizens are, so are the other citizens apt to be. So what are the key characteristics of a leading citizen in Thomas More's understanding? What kind of education and formation, for example, do leading citizens need to succeed in their vital work? What kind of character must they work to forge in themselves? How do leading citizens avoid, quote, abandoning the ship in a storm because they cannot control the winds, as More famously wrote? In his most famous book, Utopia, Thomas More writes that while monsters abound in any given society, quote, well and wisely trained citizens are the rarer thing. They are quite hard to find anywhere, Thomas More writes. So he says, look, if you want monsters, you can fill in the blank with a local town, a rival town. In Hillsdale, I always say, you want monsters? Go to Jonesville. Right? You can find them anywhere. You can find monsters anywhere. But well and wisely trained citizens? That's the rarer thing. Now that may be true, of course, but it's not impossible. And that's the hope for More. Otherwise, he wouldn't write as he does. If there is to be a rebirth of leading citizenship in our times, we need to return to the same great sources More did and to the living example offered by More and other leading citizens and see what we can learn. It's very practical. So again, what do leading citizens, well and wisely trained, need most, and how might we begin a new renaissance? In the first place, leading citizens for More need an education that truly prepares them, heart, mind, will, and conscience, for life itself, for the real demanding leading role they will be called to play on this earthly stage. In other words, any renaissance in leading citizenship requires a corresponding renaissance in education and personal formation as well. We should ask with complete sobriety, how seriously are we attending to the education, both of the young and the aspiring, and of ourselves, who possess more experience, yet stand to benefit from ongoing, even lifelong learning? For Thomas More, the best kind of education for young leaders and leading citizens remains the most time-tested and proven. An authentic liberal arts education that has as its purpose the formation and freedom of the person. There is no need to reinvent the wheel or to destroy it. Here's how the ancient Roman Seneca, another one of Thomas More's favorite authors, explained this traditional kind of education. Quote, hence you see why liberal studies are called liberal, because they are studies worthy of the free. But there is only one really liberal study, that which gives a person his liberty. That is the study of wisdom. That is lofty, brave, and great-souled. End quote. In other words, the freedom and effectiveness of human lives, indeed of civilization, are really on the line wherever such education is seriously undertaken and offered to the young. Providing such education and personal formation is among the greatest and most needed services we can provide our youth. And I'm happy to say today, after seeing so much of the Thales world this afternoon, that work is well underway here in North Carolina. Now, before moving on, let's think just a little more about what such an education involves and how it prepares the soul for real life. Ideally and broadly speaking, for Thomas More, the leading citizen needs a comprehensive education, one that will provide him or her with the philosopher's understanding of human nature and capacity for clear reasoning, the historian's knowledge of his own country, its custom, its laws, its economy, its businesses, the scientist's insight into physical nature and reality and their laws, the theologian's perspective on eternity and grace, and the poet's art of understanding and moving the human heart. Thomas More also believed, of course, that we learn by doing, and his life is a rich record of how real professional experience is the other vital way through which we learn and grow, become mature, and capable of real excellence and service to others. While More and his fellow humanists were particularly interested in furnishing young leaders with a comprehensive education, More also understood education as a real need for those of us beyond the years of our formal schooling. More himself, for example, continued to study throughout his busy professional life. He not only studied seriously during his formal education, but for 17 years after his time in Oxford, he continued to study. As one biographer relates, More was in the habit of rising early. My students are heartbroken at this point. At 4 a.m. to reflect. There's a big movement about 4 a.m. now, I hear. Thomas More was there first. More was in the habit of rising early at 4 a.m. to reflect, read, and write before the duties of the day demanded his attention, good care, and service. Thomas More was at once immersed in the detailed business of London, the real nitty-gritty work of law and governance, and yet he nevertheless established and defended a zone of silence, as one writer puts it, a habit of reflection and ongoing study that one needs to succeed intellectually and professionally and to keep growing. An ongoing life of study, then, or the habit of studiousness, is a lifelong need for leading citizens. And indeed, it's one of the secrets that keeps them happy, young at heart, and willing to serve others with the best of their lives and their loves. The key point, the takeaway here on education, is that authentic, serious education, especially through studying the great authors and the sources of our tradition, remains the indispensable first step in the formation and education of any leading citizen. Such an education strengthens one's mother wit, as Thomas More calls it, and helps one like a lasting friend throughout one's life. Who wouldn't desire such an education for our youth and for our times? Serious education like this is, in my judgment, one of the real grounds for hope at the present moment. We need to do everything we can to support, enable, and provide it for the next generation. And again, one reason I enjoy trips like this is I love coming to a place where there's all kinds of great, crazy things happening, where education is seriously being undertaken, and with it comes hope. So yes, well and wisely trained citizens may be hard to find anywhere, but the chances improve greatly when we resolve to give our aspiring young people a serious and truly useful education like More and others received. Now, in addition to gaining the grace of a solid education, leading citizens need more. They need a right understanding, the best understanding, of how virtue and good conscience lead to a life of service and peace, while self-love and pride cause shipwrecks in personal and political life. Thomas More's household in Chelsea was famous across Europe, and you can still see powerful images of his family in the portraits that survive. More's children were well educated, and his relationship with his beloved daughter Meg is justly celebrated. Meg was an author in her own right and was admired by as great a humanist as Erasmus. If you've seen Man for All Seasons, Meg is the young lady who addresses King Henry in Latin. Henry answers her, and then she goes on, and Henry's like, okay, I've had enough. Like, uncle, right? And he kind of walks away from the conversation. So he had this very, very well-educated family, and especially the young women in his family. You can read an invaluable series of letters that survive from More to his children, his wife, and others. But I want to single out one letter that Thomas More wrote to his children's teacher. This remarkable letter addresses the relationship between education and virtue and the vital importance of forming the conscience rightly so that students gain the good habits and peace of soul they truly need to work well in a stormy world, where pride and self-interest rule far too easily. In this great letter, Thomas More warns of the danger of acquiring learning without virtue, of education without personal formation. Though I prefer learning joined with virtue to all the treasures of kings, More writes, yet renown for learning, if you take away virtue, brings nothing but notorious and noteworthy infamy. So it's not enough to educate the intellect alone. Urging this focus upon personal virtue, on acquiring those habits we need to live happily and well, More advises the teacher that his children should be taught, quote, to put virtue in the first place among the goods, learning in the second, and in their studies to esteem most whatever may teach them piety towards God, charity to all, and modesty and humility in themselves. More then reminds the teacher of the importance of training the conscience. Quote, the whole fruit of learning, he urges, finally consists, quote, in the testimony of God and a good conscience. Without personal virtue and a well-formed conscience, the student will not, quote, be inwardly calm and at peace in the ordinary and extraordinary storms of life. Instead, the person will be stirred by flatterers and stung by mockers, or easily moved and dominated, especially by the desire for glory, which remains a powerful lure throughout life, regardless of age or experience. A poet I teach all the time, Milton, author of Paradise Lost, calls the desire for glory the last infirmity of a noble mind. One of the great lines of Milton. So it's tough. It's a tough out, as we used to say in baseball. The goal of teaching is thus comprehensive and places demands on the full humanity of the student. The leading citizen needs not only an authentic education of his or her mind, but the formation of the virtues and a good conscience as well. Lack of attention to virtue and conscience, Thomas More suggests, has made a shipwreck out of many promising, gifted people and their lives. We should, of course, all be on our guard here and exercise maximum care in the education and formation of the young. Again, real hope depends on it, and there is a profound danger if we continue to neglect virtue and conscience. Education must work to prepare the student for a life of virtue, good conscience, and service, or it's not worth pursuing. Now, we've spoken about the need for real education, for personal virtue and good conscience in the leading citizen. But what of the challenges that come with familial and professional life? Of the storms that come more or less as the norm of our lives? I'd like to focus now on why a citizen needs good order and integrity, especially when he or she will be called upon to pilot that ship in stormy seas. By all accounts, Thomas More was an extraordinarily busy man. It's kind of fun to list all his roles. These are just rough list. Father, husband, friend, lawyer, author, thinker, judge, diplomat, member of Parliament, Speaker of the House, High Steward of Oxford and Cambridge, Lord Chancellor of England, wretched singer on his own testimony in his local church choir. And to the everlasting marvel of my students, the man had no iPhone. How did he do it all? Is there an app for that? I don't know how he did it. To be just to each one's commitments, to serve one's priorities with order and love, to perform one's work and duties with care and personal integrity, how was this possible? How is this possible for the next generation of leading citizens? There is a striking testimony to duties and daily life in Utopia, a passage in which Thomas More describes a day in his life. And I'm going to read it for you. I love this passage. He's explaining why he is late on delivering the manuscript of Utopia to his friend. Most of my day is given to the law, Moore tells his friend. Pleading some cases, hearing others, arbitrating others, deciding still others. I pay a courtesy call to one man. I visit another on business. And so almost all the day, I'm out dealing with other people. And the rest of the day, I give it over to my family and my household. And then for myself, that is my studies, my writing, there's just nothing left. For when I get home, I have to talk with my wife, chatter with my children, consult with the servants. All these matters I consider part of my proper business, since they have to be done unless a man wants to be a stranger in his own house. And so amid the concerns I have mentioned, the day, the month, the year, it slips away. When do I write then? My only time is what I steal from sleeping and eating, end quote. So that's Thomas More right there. That's one of the best introductions you could hear to him. Now, yet it's important to note he did publish that book, Utopia, one of the great books of the Western world, while serving each of these commitments with good order, love, and cheerfulness. In doing so, More struggled to live personal integrity or oneness of life. More was the first English writer to use the word integrity, and his life might be best understood as a vigilant quest to live this most challenging of words. As one scholar explains, for Thomas More, integrity is a real personal consistency in thought, word, and action, a demanding but liberating form of life, requiring sure conscience and sure deliberation as well. Here is Thomas More and every leading citizen's core struggle: to be just one person rather than two or three or four or five, I suppose. Integrity is what makes a person a unity rather than a duplicity. Integrity makes a human life resemble a great work of art rather than a collection of fragments or a broken thing. Now, Shakespeare was quite struck by the ideal of integrity as well. You may recall the song of the witches as they dance around the cauldron. Double, double, toil and trouble. You can take it to the bank in the works of William Shakespeare. Double equals trouble. Shakespearean math in a nutshell. Now, of course, the rarer thing is that life of integrity. Also from Scripture, you might think of the Epistle of St. James, which counsels directly, do not be a double-souled man. Sometimes translated the double-minded man, but it's actually double-souled. Now, real struggle is required in this area for all of us in Thomas More's judgment, a real fight for our humanity. In one of his early poems, More describes this fight as the finest contest of all, the contest with ourselves and our unruly natures. For More, integrity is the result of, quote, spiritual battle day and night. To neglect this finest contest is to give up the field to powerful enemies, the first and most formidable of which may be ourselves. It's all too easy to take the lead role of a misleading citizen in life, to excuse ourselves from the high and difficult demands of that noble word, integrity. And yet Thomas More and others in our tradition call us precisely to this fight as if the future depends upon it, because it does. Now, after considering these points on the education and formation of a leading citizen, you may be thinking to yourself, this leading citizen business is a tall order, and you are right. But as it turns out, there's still a bit more to say. If there's to be a renaissance of leading citizens in our times, real education, personal virtue, good conscience, order, integrity are not quite enough. As More's writing and example reveal, leading citizens require a life of real friendship as well. One may go so far as to say, no real friends, no leading citizens, for Thomas More. In a famous letter, the Dutch humanist Erasmus writes that his friend More was, quote, born for friendship. Erasmus goes so far as to praise More's friendship in the highest terms. In a word, Erasmus writes, whoever desires an example of true friendship will find it nowhere to better purpose than in More. And More's life is quite rich in friendships. Friendship is so central to More's approach to life, to authorship, to leading citizenship, that one may justly say to be a true leading citizen after Thomas More's pattern and not to know how to be a real friend to one's friends, there is an impossibility, there is a contradiction. Now, I was once giving a lecture in Washington, D.C. on Thomas More, Counsels on Statesmanship. I did this as best I could do. I threw it out there for a crowd of D.C. folks. This one grizzled D.C. vet raised his hand. He said, I have a question for you, kid. And I said, fire away, sir. He said, you know what? I think it was Truman. You know what Truman said about this town? And I said, no, sir, I don't. You want a friend? Get a dog. To which I said, well, okay, fine. Maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know. Right? I have a son, by the way, there right now working on Capitol Hill. So nevertheless, I'm going to stick to my guns on this because I have all sorts of good support in the tradition on how important friendship really is. On the subject of friendship, there is again a deep connection between Thomas More and Cicero, especially to Cicero's great piece of writing on friendship. It was recently republished by Princeton with the title, How to Be a Friend. It's a very famous piece of writing. In that book, Cicero presents friendship as a bright ray of hope for citizens and republics alike. On friendship, Cicero urges that, quote, we put friendship before all things human. He defines friendship as an accord in all things, humane and divine, conjoined with mutual goodwill and affection. And he concludes, quote, I am inclined to think that with the exception of wisdom itself, no better thing has been given to man by the immortal gods than friendship. Now, I mentioned high-level support for this kind of thinking. You could go back to Plato and Aristotle on friendship. You could turn to Scripture, where you hear, if you found a true friend, you found a treasure. Look at Jonathan and David, for example. Or turn to the New Testament and hear Christ say, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. Which is one of the reasons why Thomas Aquinas defines charity as nothing other than friendship with God. So friendship is a remarkable, it's like integrity. It's a beautiful, noble word that contains within it a call to us, a challenge to us. As Erasmus testifies, no one was better in his judgment at winning friends in the first place, at being a friend, at retaining friendships, as Thomas More was. More's writings, in fact, are often presented as acts of friendship to the reader. One of his Latin poems provides the clearest image of his understanding of friendship and the need all human beings have for it. This is a translation of a Latin poem that he wrote. There can be nothing more helpful than a loyal friend, who by his own efforts assuages your hurts. Two beggars formed an alliance of firm friendship, a blind man and a lame man. The blind man said to the lame one, you must ride on my shoulders. The lame man answered, and you, blind friend, must find your way by means of my eyes. The love, amor in Latin, the love which unites, shuns the castles of proud leaders and rules in humility. So Thomas More loved friendship, and as Erasmus said, born for it. More's commitment to personal friendship was lifelong, in good seasons and bad, and continued throughout his last years and the drama of his imprisonment and death. From his prison cell, for example, More writes a beautiful letter in praise of friendship and with gratitude for its great gift in his life. This was written about 1 month before his trial and execution. And it's as simple as this. He knew this guy, Antonio Bonvisi, for 40 years, and the second to last thing he wrote was a thank you letter to him about their friendship together. So you might ask yourself, if the hourglass was emptying and you had 35 days to go before you were decapitated, what would you text about, write about, tweet about? For More, it was, I'm going to write this letter on friendship. Addressing his lifelong friend, Antonio Bonvisi, More calls him the friendliest of friends. He then explains and praises their friendship of 40 years in both human and divine terms. For the happiness of a friendship so faithful, Anthony, and so constant against the contrary blast of fortune, is a rare favor, and without a doubt a higher good, a more exalted one, arising from a certain special loving kindness of God. Certainly I do not otherwise accept or understand it than as something arranged by the unparalleled mercy of God, that among my poor little friends, a person such as you, so great a friend, was prepared so long beforehand, who might assuage and lighten by your consolation a great part of that distress which the weight of fortune, rushing headlong against me, has brought down on my head. So he looks back over those 40 years. You might think of your own best friend or a close friend. When did it begin? Did he run into Anthony Bonvisi on the streets of London and they laughed together? What happened? How did it begin? Looking back on it, he thinks, it was the providence of God that I met you then. And you were prepared to help me now, while imprisoned in the Tower of London and facing certain death. Beautiful way to look at life, it seems to me. Bonvisi, all we know about, he was a banker, he was quite famous in some ways, but he did things like bring More a warm gown, because it turns out the Tower of London is not exactly the Hampton Inn, right? Or things like this. And I was once giving a talk on this subject, and a Spaniard was in the room. And he goes, oh, in my part of Spain, he goes, we have a saying for this. And he says, when someone does something like that, some small act, he says, we just say, que detalle, what a detail. What a little thing to do out of love for your friend, que detalle. Most significantly here, Thomas More connects his own experience of friendship with Bonvisi to the love and providence of God, the true friend of the human person according to Scripture. The takeaway here, every leading citizen, and not simply Thomas More, is born for friendship, as Erasmus put it. A friendship both human and divine. Any renaissance of leading citizenship must further acknowledge and combat our friendship deficit disorder, as one contemporary writer has put it. Someone says I coined that, but I'm fairly sure I read about it in a friend's piece ages ago. I have no idea. I like the phrase, though. He urged, right now in America, for whatever reason, especially American men, are suffering from friendship deficit disorder because the culture has fallen into this state that it's in. So, acknowledging that, sure. Response? We must teach our children and one another the greatness and nobility of friendship again. We must show them how to be true friends to their friends and friends of their own country. It's worth recalling King Henry VIII and Thomas More were longtime friends. As we'll see in a moment, one might understand More's death itself as an expression of friendship for the estranged king. We might imagine More saying, I'd rather suffer imprisonment, unjust death, and the destruction of my reputation than play along with your tyranny, my old friend. More lighthearted way of putting it, friends don't let friends become tyrants. Now on that note, let's conclude our talk on leading citizens with Thomas More's death. And I'll take questions. In 1516, in the Utopia, Thomas More counseled a gifted but cynical man who might have proven a leading citizen, "Don't give up the ship in a storm because you cannot hold back the winds." End quote. Little could Thomas More know then that nearly 2 decades later, after writing these words, he would find himself imprisoned in the Tower of London, facing trial and death on the charge of malicious treason for opposing Henry's will, first in the great matter of his remarriage to Anne Boleyn, and then in the greater matter of King Henry, an earthly prince, making himself the head of the church in England. As More would remind the king and his judges at his historic trial in Westminster Hall, the Magna Carta reads, quote, "The English church shall be free," end quote. Now it's interesting, several years back, when Benedict XVI visited England, you may or may not know this, he chose to address England from the spot in Westminster Hall where this happened. Very interesting detail. He was an insightful guy. Didn't miss a beat, right? During his imprisonment and last writings, Thomas More returned again to the image of a ship's captain to lament those leaders who neglect their real duties in a storm. Such leaders are, More writes in his last major work, The Sadness of Christ, quote, "like a cowardly ship's captain who is so disheartened by the furious din of a storm that he deserts the helm, hides away cowering in some cranny, and abandons his ship to the waves," end quote. As the Italian poet Dante wrote in the Divine Comedy, such stormy seas as Thomas More faced at the end of his life are, quote, "not for leaders who would spare themselves," end quote. Through a lifetime of leading citizenship, through study, work, experience, Thomas More had prepared himself to face those last days and their many trials with peace, cheerfulness, and great strength. The virtue most associated with Thomas More's last stand as leading citizen of England is his fortitude or courage, that habitual power of enduring hardship, even death, in the service of great and high goods. In its most dramatic form, courage is the willingness to suffer wounds, the readiness to endure death for the sake of those goods. To say no to self-love and its delusions, to reject compromise and bad promises of comfort or peace, but most importantly, to say yes to the demanding, great, and noble good to which the human being is called, that is when real iron courage is required of everyone. Now, More was well aware of the terror that was being threatened against him. He tells his daughter Meg in one unforgettable letter, she had asked him, "Father, are you not aware of what they're going to do to you?" And he said, Meg, I've been here for a while. I mean, he was well familiar with England and power politics, for lack of a better term. He said, "In Chelsea, when everyone was asleep, I walked the halls of a house, and I thought, what's the worst that can happen here?" So yes, I've thought about it, dear. And of course, the worst was drawing and quartering, which if you want to read about a rather disgusting way to die, that'll do it. So, real courage required. By the way, some people don't realize, why was he not drawn and quartered? Why was he decapitated? I guess, when the king's your old friend, you get a solid, right? Yeah. So it's easier to be decapitated than drawn and quartered, and it's considered a mercy. While More's imprisonment in the Tower of London and his execution on July the 6th, 1535, reveal that he indeed possessed extraordinary courage, it's worth asking why a leading citizen would be willing to suffer imprisonment and violent death, and how such a leader could die both peacefully and perhaps the greatest surprise, with good cheer and merriment, with gladness of mind that moved onlookers to wonder. Now, we were at the school today, St. Thomas More Academy, and I was delighted to learn that one of the teachers there has composed a song about my favorite jest Thomas More made on the way to death. He asked that his beard be spared when decapitated, because at least his beard hadn't been found guilty of treason, right? So he had a sense of humor to the last. And that's kind of a modern equivalency translation of what he said. But back to the seriousness. What was all More's incredible courage for? What ends did this great virtue serve in his life and death? Though Thomas More judged the king's new laws illegal and tyrannical, though his conscience prevented him from swearing the oaths, still, Thomas More may perhaps be more fully understood as dying faithfully and courageously for the sake of what he loved most: a love of truth, love for his family and friends, love of his country, love for his church, love of God, even love for the old friends who had become his bitter enemies at the end. From his earliest poetry, written as an aspiring young man, Thomas More understood the human being as a lover, as a person who either learns to love well or badly in this business of living. Rather than cause a shipwreck for himself and those he held dear, More freely chose to, quote, die the king's good servant and God's first, as he said famously on the scaffold. That famous line was because he had been commanded to be brief. And so that's what he said, among a few other things. In the words of his friend Erasmus, Thomas More had learned through a lifetime of education, experience, and personal prayer to, quote, love whatever occurs that cannot be corrected, as if nothing happier could have happened. This is Erasmus's version of a scriptural verse Thomas More loved, omnia in bonum, from Romans chapter 8, or all things work to the good for those who love God. Perhaps most fundamentally, most necessarily, the leading citizen needs to learn to see everything and everything as coming from the hands of, quote, a tender, loving Father, as Thomas More described God in one of his earliest writings, and to whom he prayed with strong and tested faith and hard-won hope in those seemingly lonely hours before his execution. And I've actually had a chance at Yale University to hold in my hands his prayer book from the Tower of London. So I could talk about that in the Q&A. Thomas More's last days, his trial and death in particular, are well understood as his last act of friendship toward those with whom he hoped to make merry together in heaven, despite all controversy. Sir Thomas More was finally a man who had learned to say omnia in bonum to everything, to see everything in this light, as Erasmus suggested. In the final reckoning, I think, Thomas More died as he lived, educated, experienced, faithful, loving, and free, England's leading citizen. May we work together and aspire with real desire to bring about a noble renaissance of leading citizens in our country. We truly need it, I dare say, and I hope we will meet the challenge of our times together as fellow citizens and new friends. So thank you for your kind attention. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I can just field the questions from up here. You can just shoot them up. Yep. Go right ahead, sir.
Professor Smith, thanks very much for your talk. Nathan and Teal.
Nathan.
My question is twofold. I love Thomas More, and I've taught A Man for All Seasons a dozen or so times, and think it's a wonderful text to inspire students toward what you spoke about tonight. you mentioned Swift in relation to Moore. And my background is in Irish literature, so a little bit selfish, but the one part of the question, I'd be curious to hear you reflect on how Moore and Swift relate one to another.
Wow. Okay.
And then the second part of the question, because of that, both Moore and Swift seem to be supreme ironists, both as a Renaissance figure and an Alexandrian. With Moore, you get the play with Erasmus, right? In praise of folly, Panion Moria, Greek for foolish, in Moore's name, and Moore dedicates utopia, no place, but also the good place, right? Swift, you get Lemuel Gulliver, Lemuel, perhaps a reference to Solomon, the proverbial wisest man. Gulliver, one who gulls, one who tricks. So there seems to be a resonance between Swift and Moore there. But I'm curious, how do you position Moore, and by extension Swift, when it comes to their texts? Because you a couple times referred to things that Moore wrote in Utopia. But Moore is also a character in Utopia.
True.
Who seems to be a way to distance himself rhetorically from Moore, the historical figure. And you get Raphael Hythloday, that quote-unquote speaker of nonsense, who sometimes seems to function as a mouthpiece for Moore and sometimes seems a character. So how do you position what like Moore actually believes in light of a text like Utopia? And if you could connect that to Swift, it would be fantastic. But thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's a great question. I'll take up the irony in Utopia. That is one of the things that makes Moore, makes him challenging as an author and can make him hard to judge well. It's funny to look at the responses to Utopia after it was published. I mean, if we go all the way to the 20th century, I forget the exact details, but there's a monument to Thomas More's Utopia in Moscow. You know, it's the great forerunner of the Russian story in the 20th century, communism and other things. And so someone made that who thought Utopia taught that. And of course, I've taught Utopia many times, as perhaps others in the room have. And the thing you run into is this irony that was so habitual to Moore. And a kind of handy definition of irony, a simple one from antiquity, is one thing is said, another thing is meant. And so there's this play between the surface and the true meaning. And so any author who likes irony, like Plato, a Thomas More, a Shakespeare, others, can be difficult to judge precisely for this reason, because they like this kind of speaking. Gulliver's Travels. In the first place, I think the irony has a huge benefit in that it makes us sweat as readers. The very fact that we have to work so hard with our wit and our judgment to try to answer the question, what does Thomas More's Utopia mean, is certainly part of the goal, one of the goals of the book. Thomas More wants to exercise the wit of the reader, and one of the means he uses is irony. So we're familiar with workouts for our body or whatnot. What about workouts for our mind and our judgment? We may think, oh, in order to solve society's problems, that's what one of the characters in the book, all you got to do is this, and it's fine. That solves everything. That's one way to come at life. The other is to say, maybe it's more difficult than that to solve a problem. Maybe it's not as simple as take everybody's personal property away and there'll be no more pride and avarice. So More's aware of, especially the utopian tendency of the mind, and he's representing it and then challenging the reader in a way to play along and to exercise his wit. So the irony is very difficult. The playfulness of the author is worth noting. You mentioned utopia can mean no place or good place. So it's a conversation between Thomas Morris and Raphael Hythloday. Morris means fool. Hythloday means speaker of nonsense. His first name is like medicine from God. But if we focus on the last name, what is Thomas More's utopia? It's a conversation between a fool and a peddler of nonsense about no place, or a good place. And so it pokes at the mind and it draws you in to this struggle to think deeply and clearly on what we really need as human beings and what a country really needs to prosper. And it's not easy to get the answer to that. I think Raphael's far too simple. That said, More takes advantage of him to drop in some positions that he would, quote, like to see in England. So it's a very complex book, and that's sort of first answer. So too, Gulliver's Travels. I first encountered Gulliver's Travels in one of those little books with the pictures in it. And I thought, oh, isn't this really funny? He goes to this one land and everyone's big, there's little people, all these kind of things. And now I come back to that book and I think this is one of the most profound books on modernity that I've read. So I think More and Swift are kindred spirits. And they're both masters of using this kind of writing to challenge our judgment, to exercise our judgment, finally to educate it. And More suggests at the end of Utopia, there's going to be a little more conversation required, a little more cross-examination to get to the truth of the questions that are all debated in Utopia. But again, it doesn't stop the person in the 20th century from thinking, oh, it's much simpler than that. It's just all about communism. So he liked this figure of speech rhetoric, of irony, and he uses it very, very powerfully. Saying one thing, meaning another. One of the ways Quintilian defined it. Other questions? Anything at all? Sure.
You mentioned this friendship deficit disorder.
Yes.
What do you think More would say about that? Possible causes, possible solutions?
Well, one of the difficulties we have is right now, we have innumerable ways of connecting and communicating with one another, and yet maybe no intimacy in the broad sense. Now that can be too harsh on the technology here, but boy, I'm an educator. We all are in a common struggle with the gizmos. The thing that's keeping me on track up here was telling me, hurry up, Smith, you almost hit 50 minutes. Like, thank you, phone. So it's good. There's some good to it. But what I see, I remember before the revolution when the smartphones happened, I went on a sabbatical to work on a book. I left campus, worked on the book, I came back, and the first thing I noticed on the way to class the first day was that everyone was looking down at a phone, walking across campus. And that was totally new, because usually what I saw at Hillsdale was talking, laughing, arguing, discussing. And I thought, wow, something significant is shifting here and changing. And so I think that what we need to do, and I'm channeling a friend here who advises, the other thing we're obsessed with culturally is taking advantage of every moment, working hard, all this. These are good things. Industry is good. Work ethic is excellent. It's all good. But learning to waste time with each other again is the way a friend of mine put it. It's not a waste of time to invest in friendship. And friendship takes time. It's not quick. So one response would be, and I think some of the issues in the culture we could say a lot more about, but on the solution side, wouldn't it be great if we could learn to see that time with other people, real live personal time, not as a waste, not as a distraction, not as a source of stress or anxiety, but as the best investment we could make. So we can't really solve that problem without becoming good friends ourselves. I'll never forget, this is a personal thing, but a dear friend of mine, his father died. And I went to the funeral, and I was struck at the funeral by how many friendships became apparent. And I was listening to people and watching the whole thing, kind of as an observer, a bit of a stranger to it. I came from far away, I'm at the funeral. And it really struck me that my friend's father was just like someone I knew. It was his son. And I'd never known where he learned how to be such a good friend to his friends until his father's funeral. And I said, oh my goodness, I know somebody just like this guy. And so we should never underestimate how much depends on our own efforts and our own friendships. And like when we're dealing with young people, I mean, it's not, I'm teaching a class right now, and it's jam-packed, and everyone wants to read and talk about Cicero's On Friendship, which, again, has been republished as How to Be a Friend. So young people that care about that answer to that question a lot, and that ancient wisdom, it's real. So Cicero will say things like, the first law of friendship is you never do something dishonorable with a friend or ask a friend to do something dishonorable in the name of friendship. But he also talks about something that Thomas More loved, which is advice and counsel is crucial in friendship. And so learning to give and receive advice is actually at the heart of a good friendship. Not like a one-way street. I mentioned that letter that Thomas More wrote to the teacher of his kids. One of the funny counsels in there is, you're going to teach them a bunch of stuff. But if you teach them one thing, please, 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 make them love good advice instead of hating it. Like, help them acquire the right disposition toward advice and counsel in their lives. I teach literature, so I teach a play like Hamlet. And Hamlet has got a friend in that play, Horatio. But boy, he has the hardest time in the world listening to that guy, especially when he's trying to save his life. And he ends up dead early and sadly. So that advice and counsel is a really important point in Cicero and Thomas More. You know, what is our disposition toward advice and counsel? Do we seek it? Do we take it? Do we act upon it? There's so much human drama in that. And Cicero says, you know, when you get to know someone and you get really close, things are going to come up. And you might go to your friend and say, should I take this job? Or what should I do in this situation? Or whatever it is. And then the duty to give good counsel comes to the fore. Cicero says, don't flatter your friend. Don't mislead your friend. Don't lie to your friend. Don't give him love him. And love means willing the good for the other, which, as it turns out, takes courageous leadership too. So that's a longer answer to your question, but I love this subject. It's become truly important to me over the last 5 years, especially. So, all right.
One more?
Sure. One more question is great. It's 7, yeah. Sure, in the back, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in.
You're welcome.
So continuing on that vein,
Sure.
friendship. So you talked briefly about how, you maintain friendship and how important friendship is. But you can't, a friend to all is a friend to none, so you can't be friends with everybody. So what qualities do you look for, would More suggest you look for in choosing friends? And then also, and maybe this is just my mind, because, if my friend was about to decapitate me, I would be a little hesitant to call him a friend. But
That's where charity comes in. Yeah.
So what would the limits of that friendship be, and are there any limits?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned that first law that Cicero is very serious about, which is not to do something dishonorable or to use dishonorable means. That's that's a violation of the first law of friendship, Cicero says. So he puts that right up front, which is connected to another point of emphasis in that writing, which is virtue and friendship go together. And so, we tend, we might discover that we share a love with a person, and that's the initial connection. There's all sorts of ways friendship begins, but when it really takes root and really grows and really endures, it's connected to that sense of virtue and goodness. And so it's a beautiful and kind of noble ideal. On having too many friends, actually Erasmus says that Thomas More did merrily violate that advice. All that he meant was he was friendly to more. He said he had no fear of the warning against having too many friends. And so I think that is actually where revelation comes in. Cicero is a Roman, is ancient. He's certainly making a good point. I mean, I think most of us know you only have so many best friends or something like that, right? Even the word best friend suggests one. But More had that openness, to others that really was a kind of consistent mark of his life. The other thing I would mention is in Cicero's On Friendship, the hardest thing in life, he says in one place, is actually maintaining a friendship over time. And I think that's what really struck me about my friend's dad and his funeral, is that these were friendships that had been maintained over 30, 40, 50 years through small acts, reaching out, reconnecting, all these things that we kind of take them for granted. But they are what defeat the tendency of human relationships to fall apart. So Cicero is very sober about it. He's like, it's really hard. It's hard work to keep a friendship up. I think most of us know that. I reconnected with a group of friends from high school just a month ago. And we're on Google Meet all of a sudden. And we all sat there and we're like, we have not seen each other or talked to each other in 30 years. Whoa. So we all kind of had this public moment of penitence, But that's what Cicero's getting at, is it takes work, but it's a good work, right? And if we're willing to sweat at it and really invest in those small details and those small acts of service, we might end up ourselves in the Tower of London, but with Antonio Bonvisi, a lifelong friend, at our side, and not necessarily somebody who wants to decapitate us. So, but that's a good question. I mean, I think, with Henry, I was once doing a radio interview, and the host said, all right, I get it, they were friends. They used to watch the stars together. Henry loved More, and More finally had to become boring at state dinners to get home to be with his kids. So they had a good relationship, and then things changed. And so was he really a friend of his at the end? And I think in a supernatural sense, the answer is yes, actually. I really think he had every opportunity in the world to play along with the king and to be rewarded for it. And it came down to no, which I suggest in talking. The no was a yes to other things. And I always wonder what or how the death of Thomas More moved Henry VIII. Because he was a difficult guy, he's a gifted guy, but More had that cheerfulness of mind and that hope that you could die even in this way for a friend like that with a prayer, with hope. And so in his letters and at his trial, an expression that he repeats over and over again is the hope that we'll make merry together in heaven. He said, we look like enemies right now, but I do hope we'll make merry together in heaven. And he said that to the men who condemned him at trial. And these were men he had worked with his entire professional life, right? So he had that hope that friendship waits for us beyond death also. And we shouldn't be too quick to rule out an eternal friendship, even with those who appear to be our enemies right now. So really remarkable life. And I mentioned the Yale Library, my last point, I know we've got to wrap up. But one of the coolest things that I've ever done, I mean, one was to go to the Tower of London, to Thomas More's cell. That meant a lot to me, obviously. It was a great thing. But by far the closest I ever felt to Thomas More was at Yale's Beinecke Library and the rare books part of Yale. And somehow an American, if I understand correctly, bought in the early 20th century Thomas More's prayer book from the Tower of London. And the reason this is so cool is that it's really his prayer book, but he also wrote in the margins. And he wrote a very famous prayer in one section of the prayer book, top of the page, bottom page, top of the page, bottom. You'll see it printed in anthologies and stuff, but the way it was originally written was in this book. And so for me, that was one of the closest I felt to this author, was holding that book in my hands, like, wow, that's the actual handwriting of Thomas More right there. And it's this beautiful prayer that begins, to set the world at naught. Or give me the grace, good Lord, to set the world at naught. This is kind of what he was writing in the margins, sitting in the cell in the Tower of London. And so, a remarkable book. And in addition to the letters and the literary works in the Tower, he also composed some just beautiful prayers. And prayers for friends, prayers for enemies, a devout prayer when dying. I mean, it's quite remarkable literary record. So I invite you to take a look at it and get to know the life and death of this leading citizen. All right, thank you.